back when I was a child.
It was a voice that could stop time, a voice that made strangers fall in love, that turned ordinary words into eternal promises. For more than 2 decades, Luther Vandross was the soundtrack of romance. His ballads weren't just played, they were lived. Weddings, anniversaries, quiet confessions of devotion, all carried on the back of a single voice. But behind the velvet tones was a man fighting battles the public rarely saw. A boy from the Bronx who lost his father too soon. A perfectionist who built walls of sound in the studio, layering his own harmonies until they shimmered like intimacy for millions, yet carried his own loneliness and silence. This is not just the story of a singer. This is the story of a genius who redefined R&B, who sang of love until the very end, and who, even in death, remains eternal. This is the rise, the triumph, the struggle, and the legacy of Luther Vandross, the man whose voice became love itself. Record stores.
Sleep at night, my baby. I wonder, do I
For a young black teen, ways, a ticket out of struggle.
believe? But dear Lord, she's dying to dance with.
After high school, Luther briefly enrolled at Western Michigan University. It was a chance to expand, to study formally, but the fit was never structured and uninspiring compared to the raw passion he felt when he listened to a record at home. Classrooms could not contain his imagination. Professors could not teach him the nuance he was already chasing. Within a year, he returned to New York. For some, it might have looked like failure, but for Luther, it was clarity. He knew where he belonged, not in lecture halls, but in recording studios, nightclubs, and rehearsal rooms, and immersing himself in the city's music scene, eager to carve out a place not in fame, but in the fabric of the sound itself. And inspired by voices that seemed larger than life. America. The 1970s in New York City were electric. Funk pulsed in underground clubs. Disco spilled out of Manhattan dance halls. Gospel, soul, and R&B poured through church windows and community centers in Harlem and the Bronx.
My nighttime is the right time.
For a young singer like Luther Vandross, New York was not just a hometown. It was a laboratory of sound, a place where every corner carried rhythm, and every block offered a lesson in style.
If I could get another chance.
But Luther was not yet the star the world would later know. In those years, he was a worker, a craftsman, building his reputation quietly as a background vocalist.
Another walk, another dance with.
His voice appeared on stages and in studios, invisible to the public but indispensable to the music itself.
And I knew for sure I was loved.
It was David Bowie who provided Luther rock of Ziggy Stardust to something more soulful, more daring, the Young Americans album.
Have to die for the 50 more. All right.
Bowie needed gospel fire. He needed soul authenticity. And he found it in Luther Vandross. Luther not only arranged backing vocals for the record, he also co-wrote the track Fascination. Listen closely to the harmonies on that album, and you hear Luther, rich, commanding, layering Bowie's English glam with the grit of Black American soul.
Singing nothing, he cuts his hand. Showing nothing, it goes like a song she cries.
Bowie himself later credited Luther with bringing the R&B authenticity that gave Young Americans its crossover punch. To Bowie, he was a collaborator. To the world, he was still just a name in small print on the album sleeve. But in those grooves, Luther's DNA had already slipped into mainstream rock history. Broadway, too, felt his touch. Around the same time, Luther wrote Everybody Rejoice, a jubilant, soulful anthem for the hit musical The Wiz. 1978 film version starring Diana Ross and Michael Jackson.
And dread is gone. It's love, you see, that has a heart singing.
For a young songwriter from the Bronx, this was proof of concept. Luther Vandross could write music that moved people, whether in theaters or on vinyl.
Singing so blissfully, just look about.
By the late 1970s, emboldened by these successes, Luther stepped out from the shadows. He formed his own group, simply called Luther. The sound was polished, smooth, sophisticated. They released 2 albums on Cotillion Records, his 1976 self-titled debut, Luther, and the 1977 follow-up, This Close to You, that would later define his solo career.
Everybody is glad, so glad, 'cause our silent fear and dread is gone. It's love, you see.
But timing is cruel. Disco was exploding, dominating radio and dance floors. Luther's sound, romantic, soulful, intimate, didn't fit the commercial moment.
When I sleep at night, baby.
The albums failed to chart. The band dissolved. To the industry, Luther was just another failed hopeful. To Luther, it was a lesson. He could not be a background player in his own story. He needed to own the stage. In 1981, the breakthrough arrived. Luther signed with Epic Records, and with the freedom to finally shape an album under his own vision, he delivered Never Too Much. Lush, immersive, emotional worlds where love and longing took center stage. The Breakout had taken years of patience, rejection, and labor in the shadows. But by the early 1980s, Luther Vandross had arrived. He was no longer the anonymous voice behind other stars. He was the voice.
Like from out of a dream.
The one that could make a listener feel seen, desired, cherished. And as the decade unfolded, he would not only dominate the R&B landscape, he would redefine what it meant to be a balladeer in modern music. By the late 1990s, the cracks beneath Luther Vandross's carefully polished exterior were becoming harder to conceal. For 2 decades, he had stood as the voice of love, commanding, confident, irresistible. But privately, his body was waging a battle he could not outsing.
I want to share all my love.
Luther's lifelong struggle with weight had always been more than a cosmetic issue. Friends recall how he oscillated dramatically, at times losing over 100 pounds with iron discipline, only to see it return under the pressures of touring and recording.
First of all, you look wonderful.
In an industry that demanded youth and image as much as artistry, the conversation around his body often eclipsed the reverence for his music. And yet, those close to him insist that the deeper wound was not about appearance, but about health.
I'm great. I've never been in better health. I'm no longer diabetic. I no longer have high blood pressure, and that's due to...
He carried the heavy legacy of family genetics, diabetes, hypertension, and the silent shadow of heart disease. Still, Luther was not one to step away from the stage.
So right, and ooh, I need you.
Through the records that carried the same precision and velvet touch that had defined his career.
I know that you've been good to me.
But behind the perfection of the studio mixes, Luther often left sessions exhausted, physically taxed in ways audiences never saw. He would pour everything into the vocal booth, then retreat in silence, conserving what little energy he had.
They gamble on the top.
His harmonies into the early hours. In his place was a man quietly negotiating with his own body.
5-pound version of Luther Vandross, looking good.
Yet on stage, he betrayed nothing. Fans who packed theaters in the late 1990s still saw the master, a man in command of every note, able to break hearts with a single lyric. The irony was brutal. He could make thousands feel whole to the years of silent strain.
7:15, got a phone call.
telling me to get.
When he was rushed to the hospital, doctors immediately performed a tracheotomy to save his life. For fans, the news hit like a thunderclap. The man whose voice had never wavered on stage was suddenly silenced.
Thinking back on times that I wasted, I should have cherished every day.
Luther fell into a coma that lasted nearly 2 months. Around him, the
Do you feel and know that you're different than you were?
In February 2004, at the Grammy Awards, a pre-recorded message from him aired for the first time since his stroke. The audience fell silent as his face appeared on screen. His voice was frail, softer than the booming tenor fans knew, but it carried with it the same unmistakable warmth. With halting words, he thanked his fans for their prayers and love.
I want to thank everyone and for your love and support.
The message was simple, but in that simplicity lay a testament. Gratitude was stronger than despair. Behind the scenes, however, rehabilitation was grueling. Daily therapy sessions, frustrating setbacks, small victories measured in single steps or fragments of sentences.
When I say goodbye, it's never for long.
Those close to him said Luther carried both determination and resignation. He wanted desperately to sing again, but he knew the mountain ahead of him was steep.
Cause our silent fear and dread is gone. It's love, you see, that has our heart singing.
The cultural impact of his illness was enormous. Across radio stations, his songs surged back onto playlists. Fans clung to Dance with My Father, the album he had released just weeks before his stroke.
If I could get another chance.
An album whose title track, a hauntingly personal tribute to his late father, took on chilling resonance. It would go on to win Song of the Year at the 2004 Grammys, and as millions listened to the lyrics, the line between music and biography blurred.
This is business manager Carmen Romano.
Luther was no longer just the chronicler of love. He was a man confronting loss, fragility, and mortality in real time. For the first time in his career, audiences saw the man behind the myth.
Mostly sadness, though.
Sadness about
What I've experienced.
The singer who had carried so many through heartbreak and healing was himself fragile, dependent, and vulnerable. And yet, in that vulnerability, his legacy deepened. He was no longer only the voice of romance. He had become a symbol of endurance, of grace under suffering.
And sadness about.
By the early 2000s, Luther Vandross was facing what no spotlight, no applause, no platinum record could shield him from: the inevitable limits of the human body.
In reference to this all.
to supporting you.
He had given everything to his art, and now the cost was undeniable. These were his worst years, years of silence, struggle, and fading strength. And yet, even in the shadow of illness, his music refused to die.
Not much longer.
For fans across the world, A House Is Not a Home, Here and Now, So Amazing, and Dance with My Father became more than songs. They became prayers, testaments, and farewells. Luther's voice continued to echo where his body could not. And in those echoes, the world was reminded of both his greatness and his humanity. The 1980s and 1990s belonged to Luther Vandross. In an era where pop was dominated by the spectacle of Michael Jackson, the funk of Prince, and the crossover of Whitney Houston, Luther carved out a different kind of kingdom. His stage was not built on moonwalks or pyrotechnics. It was built on velvet, on silk, on the ability of one voice to make millions feel like he was singing to them, and them alone.
My dream.
His ballads weren't just songs. They were confessions whispered at midnight. They were lullabies that soothed broken hearts. They were timeless declarations that turned ordinary moments into epic ones. Tracks like A House Is Not a Home, Here and Now, So Amazing, these weren't simply radio hits. They became cultural milestones. To hear Luther was to fall in love, to stay in love, or to grieve the loss of love. He became the soundtrack to intimacy itself.
Had I tasted, can't carry you, no.
In 1981, his solo debut, Never Too Much, had introduced him to the world. But it was in the years that followed that Luther became unstoppable. Every new album was eagerly awaited, every release layered with lush arrangements, choirs of harmonies he often recorded himself, and lyrics that elevated love to something sacred. By the mid-1980s, he had established himself as the premier male R&B vocalist of his generation.
I love, there's only you.
What set him apart was not just the quality of his voice, but the way he controlled it. Luther could caress a lyric like a whisper across skin, then summon power that shook audiences to tears. His voice could plead, it could command, it could console. It was both instrument and confession. And while others chased trends, synth beats, glossy visuals, or dance crazes, Luther doubled down on sincerity. His microphone was his only prop. His presence was his performance.
If I could steal one final glance.
Live, he was transcendent. Audiences described his concerts as spiritual experiences. Women in the front row cried openly. Men, unashamed, admitted he taught them how to say the words, "I love you." Luther had a way of making the universal feel personal. He blurred the line between performer and companion, between superstar and confidant.
One final step, one final dance.
Behind the curtain, though, he was meticulous. Every show was rehearsed with surgical precision. Luther demanded obsess over lighting cues, over sound mix, over costume details. To him, a performance was an act of devotion to the audience, and anything less than perfection was unthinkable. The world saw ease. Behind the scenes was discipline bordering on obsession.
I give anything just to trade places with you.
His best years were not just measured in applause, but in recognition. Multiple Grammy Awards confirmed what audiences already knew. Luther Vandross was in a class of his own. He sold millions of records worldwide, became a fixture on R&B charts, and was embraced by mainstream America without ever compromising his soul roots.
I'm begging heaven down on my knees to help you make it through.
Culturally, his music became more than entertainment. It became ritual. Couples across generations chose his songs for their weddings, anniversaries, and first dances. Radio stations built entire late-night programs around his ballads. And when Hollywood needed a song to embody romance or heartbreak, it was Luther they turned to. His voice was stitched into the fabric of love stories. Luther remained a paradox. On stage, he was radiant, magnetic, seemingly born to be adored. Off stage, he preferred solitude. He was private, even secretive, and fiercely protective of his personal life. The same man who could bare his soul in song struggled to let people into his own reality.
One final dance with him.
His lifelong battle with weight became part of his hidden struggle. At times, he shed hundreds of pounds. At others, he gained it back. The cycle was constant. Friends said he was painfully used to let the industry dictate his artistry. The voice, not the waistline, was what mattered. And yet, this quiet battle mirrored a deeper truth about
Living with this. Living with these thoughts.
few knew the real Luther. The public knew his music, the tender lyrics, the soaring notes, the soundtracks to their most intimate memories. But the man himself remained elusive. He avoided scandal, rarely gave deeply personal interviews, and shied away from the media frenzy that surrounded many of his peers. If Michael Jackson was the king of pop, Luther Vandross was the poet of love, but a poet who preferred to let his words speak louder than his own life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I did. Okay.
Made a heck of a comeback.
Yeah, that's right.
The 1980s and 1990s were his reign, decades where he reshaped R&B, where he proved that sincerity could sell millions, where he restored ballads to a place of honor in a world-chasing spectacle. These were the best years of Luther Vandross, years where his gift became undeniable, his legacy undeniable, and his voice unforgettable. On July 1st, 2005, the world lost Luther Vandross. He was only 54. The official cause was a heart attack, a final blow after years of fighting the lingering complications from his 2003 stroke and his lifelong battle with diabetes and hypertension. For fans, it was a cruel irony. Luther's voice had been synonymous with life, with vitality, with intimacy, and yet his own body had conspired against him. The news spread quickly. Radio stations across America broke into programming. Television anchors delivered the headline with a solemn weight usually reserved for heads of state. And across neighborhoods, households, and concert halls, the reaction was visceral. People wept not just for the loss of a singer, but for the silence of a companion who had been with them through first loves, through weddings, through heartbreaks, through lonely nights. Tributes poured in from every corner of the music world. Aretha Franklin called him one of the greatest voices of all time. Stevie Wonder wept openly in interviews. Whitney Houston and Beyoncé spoke of how his artistry had shaped their own. For a moment, the competitive world of popular music was unified in grief. The giants of song bowed their heads together in respect for a man who had never needed scandal or controversy to make himself unforgettable. Across the globe, ordinary fans lit candles, held vigils, and played his records as though to keep him alive for just a little longer. Radio stations devoted entire days to his catalog. In churches, his ballads were sung like hymns. And in homes, his music once again did what it had always done. It comforted. It filled silence. It healed. Unlike many artists of his generation, Luther left behind no tabloid scandals. His nation was unsullied. What he left instead was his music, pure, timeless, and eternal. That legacy was more than enough. Even now, his songs echo in wedding halls, in radio dedications, in school dances, and in the quiet moments of lonely hearts seeking comfort. Couples still choose Here and Now as the soundtrack to their vows. Radio DJs still reach for A House Is Not a Home when speaking of love lost. And no playlist of soul classics feels complete without the title track of Never Too Much. Luther remains not just a singer, but the embodiment of romance. Luther Vandross cannot be measured only in chart positions or sales. His true impact was cultural. He redefined the male balladeer at a time when soul was being pulled in a dozen directions. He insisted that sincerity still mattered, that love songs were not a relic of the past, but a living, breathing necessity. In the 1980s and 1990s, at the height of his fame, Luther made ballads not just relevant but powerful. He reminded the world that vulnerability was strength, that a man could stand on stage and sing about longing, about devotion, about fragility, and in doing so, command an audience as surely as any rock star. He turned intimacy into spectacle, not with fireworks or choreography, but with honesty. Behind the scenes, Luther was also a mentor. Younger artists who had the chance to work with him spoke of how he demanded precision. His was not ego, it was service, service to the listener, service to the song. When I say goodbye, it is never. And in his studio methods, too, his legacy endures. Long before digital layering became the norm, Luther pioneered the technique of recording his own background vocals in stacks, creating choirs of Luther harmonies. Producers still point to those recordings as a masterclass in vocal arrangement, a lesson in how discipline and creativity could coexist. Even in his death, Luther's music continued to find new life. The album Dance with My Father, released just before his stroke, became a cultural landmark. Its title track, a deeply personal ballad about his late father, resonated across generations. It became both his farewell and his eternal statement. The song went on to win the Grammy for Song of the Year in 2004, and in the years after his passing, it grew into a hymn of remembrance for families everywhere. In funerals, in anniversaries, in private rituals of memory, the song carried his spirit forward. And this was perhaps Luther's greatest gift. He turned his own pain into universal beauty. He sang not just about love, but about loss, about longing, about the fragile threads that bind families together. His music was always personal, yet it belonged to everyone.
That has a heart singing so blissfully. Just look up loud.
To this day, when people speak of love songs, they speak of Luther Vandross, not just because he sang about love, but because he embodied it. His voice was tenderness made sound. His lyrics were vulnerability turned into poetry. He didn't just perform love songs. He was love set to music. Though his life was cut short, Luther Vandross is not gone. He lives in the countless first dances of newlyweds, in the late-night radio dedications whispered across cities, in the playlists of those nursing heartbreak, and in the laughter of families celebrating anniversaries. His music did not just survive him. It carried him forward, ensuring he will never be forgotten. Luther Vandross remains eternal, a man who sang of love until his final breath, and in doing so, became love's truest voice.
For another dollar, I'd rather be with you, 'cause you make my heart scream and holler.